The gun pressed against Maya Johnson's temple, cold and unforgiving. The metal bit into her skin as Lee Hyun-woo's finger twitched on the trigger, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Call your husband," he demanded, his voice echoing through the blood-splattered emergency room of Seoul Metropolitan Hospital. Around them, hostages lay flat on the floor, their breathing shallow and terrified. Maya's colleagues stared at her in confusion. Husband? Maya Johnson, the quiet trauma nurse who never wore a ring, never mentioned a man, never even took personal calls during her countless overnight shifts. But as the gunman's radio crackled with a name that made every gang member in Seoul tremble, Kong Kyung-gu is en route, Maya realized her 6-month secret was about to destroy everything. "I'm his wife," she whispered, and watched her entire world shatter in their eyes. The shocked silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Sarah Chun, Maya's closest colleague, stared at her as if seeing a stranger. The other nurses exchanged bewildered glances, their fear momentarily replaced by utter disbelief. How had Maya Johnson, the American nurse who always volunteered for extra shifts, who brought homemade cookies to the break room, who seemed to live and breathe emergency medicine, married the most dangerous man in Seoul's underworld? Lee Hyun-woo lowered his gun slightly, his eyes narrowing as recognition flickered across his face. "The American nurse," he said slowly, speaking into his radio. "The one from the alley 6 months ago. We found her. 2 hours earlier, Maya had walked through those same hospital doors with nothing more on her mind than surviving another 12-hour night shift." The Seoul Metropolitan Hospital emergency room was always chaos after midnight. A constant stream of motorcycle accidents, industrial injuries, and the occasional gang violence that characterized South Korea's glittering capital city. Maya had pulled her dark hair into a practical ponytail, checked that the delicate chain around her neck was hidden beneath her scrubs, and prepared herself for the organized pandemonium that awaited her. She had no way of knowing that this shift would be the one that exposed every carefully constructed lie she'd been living. "You look tired," Dr. Sarah Chun had observed when Maya entered the staff room, her keen eyes missing nothing as usual. Sarah was more than a colleague. Over the past year, she'd become Maya's closest friend in Seoul, the person who'd helped her navigate Korean culture, taught her essential medical terminology in Korean, and shared countless late-night meals during their overlapping shifts. "Everything okay?" Maya had forced a smile, touching her phone in her pocket where a single encrypted message waited. "Penthouse. 6 a.m. Miss you. K." The message made her heart ache with longing and guilt in equal measure. Just the usual, she'd lied smoothly, the deception coming easier now after 6 months of practice. You know how it is? What Sarah didn't know, what none of them knew, was that when Maya left the hospital each morning, she didn't return to a modest apartment in a respectable neighborhood. She went home to a luxury penthouse in Gangnam, where armed guards nodded respectfully and called her Mrs. Kong, where the most feared Mafia boss in Seoul waited for her with coffee already brewing and genuine worry in his dark eyes if she was even 5 minutes late. The ring that proved her marriage hung on that hidden chain, warm against her skin, a constant reminder of the double life she was living. The night had started like any other. A motorcycle accident victim arrived at 12:30, his leg badly broken, but his life not in danger. An elderly woman came in at 1:15 with stroke symptoms, and Maya had moved with practiced efficiency to get her into imaging. At 1:45, they'd received a knife wound victim, a young man with gang tattoos who'd looked at Maya with sharp, knowing eyes as she'd cleaned and stitched his wounds. He'd said nothing, but something in his expression had made her uneasy. In Seoul's underworld, the Kong name carried weight, and Maya had learned that even in a hospital, the criminal organizations had eyes everywhere. She tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on her work. This was why she'd begged Kyung-gu to let her keep her career when they'd married. Nursing wasn't just her profession. It was her identity, her purpose, the thing that made her feel human and useful in a world that had become far more complicated than she'd ever imagined when she'd first moved to Seoul 2 years ago to work in one of Asia's most advanced medical facilities. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come to Korea to save lives, and she'd ended up married to a man who, by necessity of his position, sometimes took them. At 2:30, she'd stepped outside for a brief break, breathing in the cool Seoul night air. The city sprawled below, a glittering maze of neon and steel. Somewhere out there, Kyung-gu was handling whatever business required his attention at this hour. She learned not to ask too many questions about his work, just as he'd learned not to pry too deeply into the emotional toll her work sometimes took. They existed in separate spheres that only overlapped in the private sanctuary of their home, where the ruthless Kang Kyung-gu became simply the man who held her close and whispered that she was the only good thing in his life. The memory of how they'd met still haunted her nightmares. 6 months ago, Maya had been leaving a late shift, exhausted and thinking only of her bed. She'd taken a shortcut through an alley in Gangnam, a route she'd walked dozens of times. But that night, she'd walked into hell. 3 men had surrounded another, and even in the darkness, Maya had seen the gleam of weapons. She'd frozen, her nursing instincts screaming at her to help, her survival instincts telling her to run. Before she could decide, gunshots had shattered the night. The man in the center had dropped, blood pooling beneath him, and Maya had gasped. A small sound, but enough. One of the killers had turned, his eyes locking onto hers. "Witness," he'd said, and suddenly they were all looking at her. Maya had run. She'd run faster than she'd ever run in her life, her heart pounding, her breath coming in terrified gasps. Behind her, she'd heard footsteps, shouts in Korean. She'd burst out of the alley system directly into a group of men in expensive suits, crashing into the chest of the tallest one. Strong hands had caught her, steadied her, and she'd looked up into the coldest, most beautiful face she'd ever seen. "Please," she'd gasped in broken Korean. "They're chasing me. They killed someone. Please." The man had looked past her at her pursuers, who'd skidded to a stop when they'd recognized him. The change in their demeanor had been instant, from aggressive hunters to nervous subordinates. Lee Hyun-woo, the man holding Maya, had said, his voice like ice, "You're hunting on Kong territory." "She's a witness, Kang Kyung-gu," the killer had replied. "She saw Choi's men eliminate your lieutenant. We can't let her live." "No," Kyung-gu had said simply. "You can't touch her. She's under my protection now." His arm had tightened around Maya. "In fact, as of this moment, she's my fiancée. Tell Choi Sung-ho that if he touches her, it's war." Maya had stared up at him in shock, but Kyung-gu's expression had remained impassive. The killers had exchanged glances, then retreated into the shadows. Only when they disappeared had Kyung-gu looked down at Maya. "You saw something you shouldn't have," he'd said quietly. "Now you're mine to protect." That night had changed everything. Kyung-gu had taken Maya to his penthouse, a sprawling luxury apartment that occupied the entire top floor of one of Gangnam's most exclusive buildings. She'd been terrified, confused, and acutely aware that she'd just witnessed a murder. "I don't understand," she'd said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Why did you tell them I'm your fiancé?" "Because Choi Sung-ho won't touch Kang Kyung-gu's woman," he'd replied, pouring her tea with surprising gentleness. "You're marked now. Those men saw your face. They know you witnessed their kill. The only thing keeping you alive is my claim on you. So what happens now?" Maya had asked, her hands shaking as she accepted the cup. "Do I just hide here forever?" "No," Kyung-gu had said, sitting across from her. "We make it official. We marry. You become my wife in truth, not just in words. It's the only way to guarantee your safety." He'd paused, studying her face. "I know this isn't what you wanted. I know it's not fair, but it's the only option that keeps you breathing." Maya had spent 3 days in that penthouse, trying to process the impossible situation she'd found herself in. Kyung-gu had been surprisingly patient, never pushing, never demanding. His younger brother Young-chul had visited, along with his right-hand man Park Byung-wook, both treating her with careful respect. They'd explained the reality of Seoul's underworld, the territories, the unspoken rules, the blood feuds that had existed for generations. The Choi and Kang families had been rivals for decades, each controlling different sectors of the city's criminal enterprises. A witness to a Choi assassination on Kong territory was more than just a liability. She was a spark that could ignite a war. "My brother doesn't do this," young Chul had told her privately. "He doesn't claim women for protection. He doesn't involve civilians. But something about you." He'd shrugged. "Maybe you remind him he's still human." The marriage ceremony had been small, witnessed only by Park Byung-wook and Young Chul in a private room that probably cost more than Maya's entire year's salary. Kyung-gu had produced a ring, a simple platinum band engraved with their names in both English and Korean. And when he'd slipped it onto her finger, his hand had been steady while hers trembled. "I won't take your life from you," he'd promised. "Keep your nursing career. Keep your apartment if you want. I'm giving you protection, not a cage." But Maya hadn't kept her apartment. Slowly, over weeks and then months, she'd moved into the penthouse, drawn by something she hadn't expected. Kyung-gu's unexpected vulnerability when they were alone. The cold, ruthless mafia boss who terrified Seoul's criminal underworld would come home exhausted, blood sometimes on his hands, and she would clean his wounds while he told her things he'd never told anyone. About his father's brutal legacy, about the weight of leading an organization he'd never wanted to inherit, about the impossible choices he faced daily between honor and survival. "You're the only clean thing in my filthy world," he told her one night, his head in her lap as she ran her fingers through his hair. "I won't contaminate you." But he had taught her to survive his world anyway. Park Byung-wook had trained her in hand-to-hand combat, teaching her pressure points and escape techniques. Kyung-gu himself had taught her to shoot, to read situations, to trust her instincts. "If you're my wife, you need to be able to protect yourself," he'd insisted, even as he tried to keep her separate from the organization's operations. The contradiction hadn't escaped Maya. He wanted her safe from his world while simultaneously preparing her to survive it. Their relationship had evolved from a marriage of convenience into something neither of them had anticipated. Maya had fallen in love with a man who cooked ramen at 3 a.m. when they were both unable to sleep, who listened intently when she talked about difficult cases at the hospital, who held her with a tenderness that contradicted everything his reputation suggested. And Kyung-gu, the man who'd built walls around his heart since childhood, had found himself completely undone by a woman who looked at him and saw not a monster, but simply a man trying to survive impossible circumstances. The secrecy had been Maya's choice. "If people at the hospital know who I'm married to, everything changes," she told Kyung-gu. "They'll treat me differently. They'll be afraid. And I need to be just Maya Johnson, trauma nurse, not Mrs. Kong, the mafia boss's wife." He'd agreed, understanding her need to maintain that separation. So Maya had lived a double life. 12-hour shifts at the hospital, where she was the reliable, single American nurse, followed by returns to a penthouse where armed guards bowed respectfully and her husband ran a criminal empire from his study. She'd worn her ring on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her scrubs, a secret pressed close to her heart. Until tonight, when that secret had become her only bargaining chip to save lives. The assault had come at 2:47 in the morning. Maya had been suturing a laceration on a construction worker's arm when the hospital's glass entrance had exploded inward. 7 armed men had stormed through, automatic weapons raised, their faces covered with masks bearing the Choi Syndicate's symbol. Everyone on the ground. Lee Hyun-woo had shouted in Korean, and chaos had erupted. Patients screamed, nurses dropped behind a reception desk, and Dr. Sarah Chun had grabbed Maya's arm, pulling her down. "What's happening?" Sarah had whispered, her face pale with terror. Maya's tactical training had kicked in automatically, counting attackers, noting exits, assessing weapons. 7 men, all armed with pistols and 2 with automatic rifles. 3 exits, main entrance now blocked, emergency exit to the east, staff corridor to the west. 12 hostages including staff and patients. Her mind had calculated odds and scenarios even as her heart pounded with fear. This was the nightmare Kyung-gu had prepared her for, the moment when his world and hers would inevitably collide. "We know Kang Kyung-gu was shot tonight," Lee Hyun-woo had announced, walking through the ER with predatory confidence. "We know he's being treated here. Someone tell me where he is, or people start dying." Maya's blood had run cold. Kyung-gu had been shot. When? He'd sent her that message just hours ago. Was he hurt? Was he safe? Her mind had raced with worry, even as she'd forced herself to remain calm. The gunmen were searching treatment rooms, overturning equipment, their frustration growing with each empty space they found. Maybe he's not here, one of them had suggested. Then we wait, Lee Hyun-woo had replied. Eventually, the great Kang Kyung-gu will come for his wounded. Or, his eyes had scanned the hostages. We start eliminating people until he shows up. A hospital under siege, that'll draw him out. Maya had watched as he'd grabbed the elderly stroke patient she'd treated earlier, dragging the confused woman to the center of the room. The woman's daughter had screamed, lunging forward, only to be knocked back by another gunman. Please, the daughter had begged. She doesn't know anything. She's just sick. Then someone else better start talking, Lee Hyun-woo had said, pressing his gun to the elderly woman's head. 60 seconds. Where's Kang Kyung-gu? The countdown had begun. 60, 59, 58. Maya had felt every second like a physical blow. She'd looked at her colleagues, Sarah's terrified face, the young nurse who'd just started last month crying silently, the security guard who'd always greeted her with a smile, now lying motionless near the entrance, shot when he'd tried to intervene. These were good people, innocent people, people who'd dedicated their lives to healing, now caught in a war they didn't understand. 45, 44, 43. Maya's mind had flashed back to a conversation she'd had with Kyung-gu just 3 nights ago. They'd been lying in bed, the Seoul skyline glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and she'd asked him the question that had been haunting her. If something happens, if your enemies find out about me, what should I do? Kyung-gu had pulled her closer, his arms tightening around her. You stay hidden, he'd said firmly. You don't reveal yourself. You don't become a target. Promise me, Maya, whatever happens, you protect yourself first. Even if people die, she'd whispered. He'd been silent for a long moment. Even then, I can handle the guilt of innocent deaths. I can't handle losing you. But Maya had seen something in his eyes that contradicted his words. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion with the violence. A yearning for a different kind of life. She'd kissed him then, tasting the lie they both knew he was telling. Kyung-gu had spent his entire life trying to minimize collateral damage, trying to keep his brutal world separate from the innocent civilians of Seoul. It was why he'd insisted she keep her nursing career, why he'd never asked her to participate in organization business, why he'd built such careful walls between his two lives. 30, 29, 28. Dr. Sarah Chan had turned to look at Maya, and in her friend's eyes, Maya had seen a terrible question forming. Sarah knew something was wrong. Over their year of friendship, she'd noticed too many small inconsistencies. The expensive watch Maya sometimes forgot to remove, the way she'd slip away to take encrypted phone calls, the fact that she never dated despite being beautiful and kind. Maya, Sarah had whispered, barely audible over the elderly patient's frightened whimpering. Do you know something? 20, 19, 18. The young nurse who'd started last month had been sobbing openly now, her hands clasped in prayer. The construction worker whose arm Maya had been suturing lay perfectly still, his eyes squeezed shut. Everyone in that emergency room was holding their breath, hoping someone else would speak, would save them, would make this nightmare end. 10, 9, 8. Maya had felt the weight of her wedding ring against her chest, warm from her body heat. She'd thought about Kyung-gu's face the last time she'd seen him, the way he'd kissed her forehead before she'd left for a shift. Come home safe, he'd murmured, the same words he always said, as if repetition could make it true. She'd thought about the life they'd built together, fragile and hidden, but real nonetheless. She'd thought about the promise she'd made him, and then she'd thought about the Hippocratic oath she'd taken when she'd become a nurse. First, do no harm. She'd spent her entire adult life saving people, fighting for every life that came through the ER doors. How could she stay silent and watch an innocent woman die? 7, 6, 5. Maya had stood up, her legs shaking but her voice steady. Stop. Every eye in the room had turned to her. Lee Hyun-woo's finger had paused on the trigger. You have something to say, nurse? On what you want, Maya had said, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Let her go. I'm what you want." "Who are you?" Lee Hyun-woo had demanded, but something in his expression had shifted. Recognition, perhaps, or suspicion. Maya had reached beneath her scrubs and pulled out the chain, letting it slide through her fingers until the ring appeared. The platinum caught the harsh fluorescent lights, the engraved names clearly visible. She'd slipped it onto her finger where it belonged, where it had always belonged, and lifted her chin. "I'm Kang Kyung-goo's wife." The silence that had followed had been absolute. Then everyone had started talking at once. Dr. Sarah Chun had gasped, "What?" The other nurses had whispered frantically to each other. The construction worker had stared at her, as if she'd grown a second head. But Lee Hyun-woo's reaction had been the most chilling. A slow, predatory smile had spread across his face. "The American nurse," he'd said, speaking into his radio with barely contained excitement. "Boss, we have her. Kang Kyung-goo's wife. She's been here the whole time, hiding in plain sight." The voice that had crackled back through the radio had been older, rougher. Choi Sung-ho himself. "The woman from the alley? You're certain? She has his ring. She just admitted it in front of witnesses." Lee Hyun-woo had walked toward Maya slowly, circling her like a shark. "I remember you now. 6 months ago, you saw us kill Park Dae-young. You ran right into Kang's arms. We thought he was bluffing when he claimed you were his, some ploy to protect a random witness. But you actually married him. You stupid, stupid girl." Maya had met his gaze without flinching. "Let these people go. They have nothing to do with this. You have me. That's what you need." "Maya, what are you doing?" Sarah had whispered, her voice breaking. "This can't be real. You're married to Kang Kyung-goo, the crime boss? How is that possible?" Before Maya could answer, Lee Hyun-woo had grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her to the center of the room. He'd shoved the elderly patient away. The woman had collapsed in her daughter's arms, sobbing with relief, and replaced her with Maya. The cold barrel of his gun had pressed against Maya's temple, and she'd forced herself to breathe slowly, to stay calm, to remember everything Kyung-goo and Park Byung-wook had taught her about staying alive in impossible situations. "Call him," Lee Hyun-woo had ordered, pressing a phone into her hand. "Call your husband and tell him to come." Maya's fingers had trembled as she dialed the number she knew by heart. It had rung once, twice. Then Kyung-goo's voice, tense with worry even in that single word, "Maya." Just hearing him had made her chest tighten with emotion. "They have me at the hospital," she'd said quietly. "The Choice Syndicate. They're holding the ER hostage." There had been a brief silence, and then Kyung-goo's voice had turned to ice, the voice of the man who ruled Seoul's underworld. "Put him on." Lee Hyun-woo had snatched the phone. "Kang Kyung-goo, we have your wife. Come alone, unarmed, or we execute her live on the internet for all of Seoul to watch. You have 30 minutes. If you hurt her," Kyung-goo had started, but Lee Hyun-woo had cut him off. 30 minutes. Clock's ticking. He'd ended the call and turned to his men. "Barricade all exits. Set up cameras. We're going to broadcast this to every corner of the underworld." The great Kang Kyung-goo, brought to his knees by a woman. As the gunman had moved to secure the hospital, Maya had caught Dr. Sarah Chen's eye. Sarah had pushed closer, ignoring the guns pointed in her direction. "Is this real?" she'd whispered urgently. "Are you really married to him?" "Yes," Maya had admitted, and saying it out loud had felt like both a relief and a death sentence. "For 6 months. I'm sorry I lied to you. 6 months." Sarah's face had cycled through shock, hurt, and confusion. "We have lunch together 3 times a week. We talk about everything. How did I not know?" "Because I didn't want you to," Maya had said softly. "I wanted to keep this part of my life separate. I wanted to just be Maya Johnson, nurse, not Mrs. Kong, the Mafia boss's wife." "Are you safe with him?" Sarah had asked, and despite everything, despite the guns and the hostages and the violence surrounding them, the question had been genuine. "Does he hurt you?" Maya had shaken her head. "Never. It's complicated, Sarah, but he's never hurt me. He protects me." "Then why does this feel like the opposite of protection?" Sarah had gestured at the armed men, the terrified hostages, the blood on the floor from the security guard who'd been shot. Maya hadn't had an answer for that. The 30 minutes that followed had been the longest of Maya's life. Lee Hyun-woo had ordered his men to tie the hostage's hands with medical tape, but he'd left Maya unbound, confident that she wouldn't run with innocent lives at stake. He'd been right. Maya had stayed exactly where she was, her mind racing through possibilities and escape routes, her nursing instincts fighting against her survival training. She'd watched as the gunman had set up cameras, positioning them to capture every angle of the emergency room. This wasn't just about killing Kyung-gu. It was about humiliating him, breaking him publicly, destroying the reputation that kept the Kong organization powerful. In Seoul's underworld, respect was currency, and Choi Sung-ho intended to bankrupt his rival in the most spectacular way possible. "You really love him?" one of the younger gunmen had asked Maya, his curiosity apparently overriding his professionalism. He couldn't have been more than 22, with nervous eyes that suggested this was perhaps his first major operation. Maya had looked at him steadily. "Yes. Why? He's a killer. A criminal. You're a nurse. You save lives. How can you love someone like that?" It was a question Maya had asked herself countless times over the past 6 months, lying awake at night, while Kyung-gu slept beside her, his face peaceful in a way it never was during waking hours. "People are more than the worst things they've done," she'd said finally. "He's trying to survive a world he didn't choose, just like all of us." The young gunman had looked like he wanted to say more, but Lee Hyun-woo had cut him off. "Enough talking. Guard the exits." Maya had used the forced waiting period strategically. She'd moved among the hostages, checking on injuries, offering what comfort she could while her hands had worked with purpose. To anyone watching, she'd appeared to be simply doing her job as a nurse. But in reality, she'd been preparing the battlefield. She'd loosened oxygen tank valves in strategic locations, creating potential explosive hazards that could be triggered with a single spark. She'd palmed scalpels and hidden them in her pockets, within arm's reach. She'd disabled the safety mechanisms on 2 of the defibrillators, turning them into weapons that could deliver incapacitating shocks. Dr. Sarah Chun had watched these preparations with growing understanding. "You know how to fight," she'd whispered when Maya had knelt beside her, supposedly checking her pulse. "My husband taught me," Maya had admitted quietly. "He said if I was going to be his wife, I needed to be able to survive his world." "Is he really coming?" the construction worker had asked, his voice tight with fear. "Alone? Won't they just kill both of you?" Maya had smiled grimly. "He's not coming alone. He'll say he is, but Kong Kyung-gu doesn't follow rules. He just makes people think he does." She'd been proven right 20 minutes into the countdown when Lee Hyun-woo's radio had crackled with urgent reports from the perimeter guards. Black SUVs approaching from multiple directions. At least 15 vehicles. "Boss, he's brought an army." Lee Hyun-woo had cursed viciously. "I told him to come alone. Did you really think he would?" Maya had asked. "You're threatening his wife. He's going to bring hell itself to get me back." Across the city, in his private office, Kong Kyung-gu had been doing exactly that. The moment he'd ended the call with Lee Hyun-woo, he'd activated every resource at his disposal. Young Chul had burst into the office within seconds, alerted by the emergency signal that had gone out to all senior members of the organization. "They have Maya," Kyung-gu had said, his voice dangerously calm. "At the hospital. Hostage situation. Choi's men." Young Chul's face had gone pale. "Brother, it's a trap. They want you dead. If you go." "I'm going," Kyung-gu had interrupted, already strapping on his weapons. "The question is how many men I'm taking with me." Park Byung-wook had entered, his expression grim. "I've already mobilized our forces. Every available soldier is ready. But Kyung-gu, you need to think strategically. This is what Choi wants. You emotional, reckless, vulnerable." "I don't care what he wants," Kyung-gu had replied, checking his gun with practiced efficiency. "My wife is in danger. I'm getting her out, even if it costs you your life." Young Chul had demanded. Maya wouldn't want that. Kyung-gu had paused then, his hands stilling on his weapons. He'd thought about Maya's face, her smile, the way she'd touch his cheek and tell him he was more than his father's legacy. He'd thought about the life they'd built together, the fragile peace they'd found in each other. And he'd thought about the promise he'd made to himself the day he'd married her, that he would protect her, no matter the cost. "She's my wife," he'd said quietly. She's the only thing in this world worth dying for. So yes, young Chul, even if it costs me my life. The two brothers had looked at each other, and young Chul had seen the absolute determination in his older brother's eyes. There'd be no talking him out of this. Then we do it smart, young Chul had said finally. We go in with overwhelming force. We don't give them a chance to hurt her. Park Byung-wook had spread a map of the hospital on the desk. 3 entry points. Main entrance, emergency exit, underground parking garage. We position snipers on the surrounding buildings, cut off their escape routes, and we move in synchronized. Fast and brutal. No, Kyung-gu had said. I go in alone through the main entrance. You and the men secure the perimeter, but you don't move until I give the signal. This is about more than just Maya. It's about sending a message. Choi Sung-ho wants to humiliate me publicly. Fine, let him try. But when I walk out of that hospital with my wife, every criminal in Seoul will know you don't touch what belongs to Kang Kyung-gu. The plan had been risky, borderline suicidal, but it was vintage Kyung-gu, bold, theatrical, and calculated to reinforce his reputation even in the midst of crisis. As he prepared to leave, young Chul had grabbed his arm. If something happens to you, what do I tell her? Kyung-gu had smiled, a rare, genuine expression. Tell her she made me human again. Back in the hospital, Maya had felt the shift in atmosphere as the arrival time approached. The gunmen had grown more nervous, their fingers tight on their triggers. Lee Hyun-woo had been speaking urgently into his phone with Choi Sung-ho, receiving instructions. The cameras had been positioned perfectly, ready to broadcast whatever was about to happen to the entire Seoul underworld. He's here, one of the lookouts had reported. Single vehicle. Only one person inside. Lee Hyun-woo had smiled triumphantly. The great Kang Kyung-gu, walking into a trap for a woman. How the mighty have fallen. He'd grabbed Maya's arm, positioning her in the center of the room where the cameras could capture everything. Don't move. Don't speak unless I tell you to. Your husband is about to learn what happens when you defy Choi Sung-ho. Maya had felt her heart pounding, but she'd kept her expression calm. She'd caught Dr. Sarah Chen's eye and given the smallest nod, be ready. Sarah had understood, subtly shifting position to shield some of the other hostages. The construction worker had tensed, preparing for whatever was about to happen. Even the young nurse who'd been crying had stopped, watching Maya with a mixture of fear and something that might have been hope. The hospital's main entrance doors had slid open, and Kang Kyung-gu had walked in. He'd been dressed entirely in black, his hands raised to show he was unarmed, but his presence had filled the room like a physical force. Every gunman had straightened, their fear palpable even behind their masks. This was the man who'd built an empire on ruthlessness and strategic brilliance, who'd survived 3 assassination attempts before his 30th birthday, who'd crushed rival organizations with calculated precision. But Maya hadn't seen the legendary crime boss. She'd seen her husband, the man who made her coffee every morning, who listened to her talk about difficult cases, who held her when nightmares woke her. His dark eyes had found hers immediately across the crowded emergency room, and in them she'd seen relief, rage, and love in equal measure. Let her go, Kyung-gu had said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. This is between you and me, Lee Hyun-woo. These people are innocent. My wife is innocent. Let them all go. Lee Hyun-woo had laughed, pressing his gun harder against Maya's head. Innocent? She witnessed a murder. She married you knowing exactly what you are. She's as dirty as the rest of us now. She's a nurse who saves lives, Kyung-gu had replied, taking a careful step forward. She's a better person than any of us in this room, including me. Whatever sins I carry, she doesn't share them. Touching. Choi Sung-ho's voice had crackled through the speakers that Lee Hyun-woo had set up. The crime boss was watching remotely, orchestrating this humiliation from the safety of his compound. But she chose you, Kang Kyung-gu. She chose to bind herself to a monster. That makes her complicit in every death you've caused, every family you've destroyed. Maya had felt anger surge through her at those words. She'd spent 6 months questioning her choices, wrestling with the moral complexity of loving a man whose world was built on violence. But hearing Choi Sung-ho reduce her decision to simple complicity had ignited something fierce in her chest. "I chose love," she'd said loudly, surprising everyone, including herself. "I chose to see the humanity in someone everyone else had written off as a monster. That's not complicity, that's hope." Lee Hyun-woo had backhanded her, the blow splitting her lip. Kyung-gu had moved instantly, rage transforming his features, but 3 guns had immediately pointed at Maya's head, stopping him. "Don't," Lee Hyun-woo had warned. "One more step, and I splatter her brains across this floor." Maya had tasted blood, but she'd smiled through it. "You're afraid of him," she'd observed, looking at Lee Hyun-woo. "All of you are. That's why you need me, because you know in a fair fight, Kang Kyung-gu would destroy every single one of you." "Shut up," Lee Hyun-woo had snarled, but Maya had seen the truth of her words in his eyes. Kyung-gu had forced himself to stillness, his tactical mind working through scenarios. He'd counted 7 armed men, 12 hostages including Maya, multiple exits that were probably guarded. The odds were terrible, but he'd faced worse. What made this different, what made this almost unbearable, was that Maya was at the center of it. Every other fight in his life, he'd been willing to risk his own death. But the thought of Maya being hurt, of watching her die, made his legendary composure crack. "What do you want, Choi?" Kyung-gu had addressed the speakers directly. "This isn't about territory or money. What's your endgame?" "I want you broken," Choi Sung-ho had replied. "I want all of Seoul to see the great Kang, Kyung-gu, helpless, begging for his woman's life. I want your organization to crumble because their leader was weak enough to love." "Love isn't weakness," Maya had said. And this time when Lee Hyun-woo had raised his hand to strike her again, she'd been ready. Her tactical training had kicked in with crystalline clarity. She grabbed his wrist, twisted with the precise pressure point technique Park Byung-wook had drilled into her, and used his momentum to throw him off balance. The gun had discharged wildly, the bullet embedding in the ceiling, and suddenly chaos had erupted. Kyung-gu had moved like lightning, crossing the room in seconds. He disarmed the nearest gunman with brutal efficiency, using the man's body as a shield as the others had opened fire. Dr. Sarah Chun had reacted with surprising speed, pulling hostages behind the overturned gurneys Maya had strategically positioned earlier. The construction worker had kicked out at another gunman, sending him sprawling. Maya had rolled toward the oxygen tanks she'd sabotaged, grabbing one and swinging it hard into Lee Hyun-woo's head as he tried to recover. The impact had sent him crashing into medical equipment, blood streaming from his temple. She'd grabbed the scalpel from her pocket, cutting through the tape binding the nearest hostages. "Get to the emergency exit," she'd ordered, her voice carrying the same authority she used during trauma situations. Now, the hospital's windows had shattered as Kyung-gu's snipers had taken position, and suddenly armed men in black had poured through every entrance. Young Chul had led one team, Park Byung-wook another, and within seconds the Choi Syndicate's men had been overwhelmed. But Lee Hyun-woo had recovered faster than Maya had expected, grabbing her from behind and pressing his gun to her throat. "Everyone stop," he'd screamed, using Maya as a shield. "Stop, or she dies." The gunfire had ceased immediately. Kyung-gu had frozen mid-motion, his gun pointed at Lee Hyun-woo's head, but unable to fire without risking Maya. They'd locked eyes across the room, husband and wife, connected by a bond that had started as necessity and transformed into something neither had expected. "Kyung-gu, don't," Maya had said quietly. In her peripheral vision, she could see the defibrillator she'd sabotaged earlier, just within arm's reach. "Don't sacrifice yourself for me." "Always," he'd replied simply. "Always for you." Maya had remembered another conversation, weeks ago, when Kyung-gu had been teaching her to survive. "If you're ever held hostage," he'd said, "trust yourself. You're stronger than you know. Look for openings. Create chaos. And never, ever give up." She'd seen the opening. Lee Hyun-woo's grip had loosened fractionally as he'd focused on Kyung-gu, his attention divided. Maya had slammed her elbow backward into his ribs, grabbed the defibrillator paddles, and activated them against his chest. The modified electrical charge had sent him convulsing to the ground, his gun clattering away. Kyung-gu had reached her in 2 strides, pulling her against him with such force that her breath had left her lungs. "You're insane," he'd whispered into her hair. "Brilliant and insane." "I learned from you," she'd replied, wrapping her arms around him. The cleanup had been swift. Park Byung-wook had secured the remaining Choi gunmen. Young Chul had organized the evacuation of hostages to safety. The Seoul police had arrived, but with typical deference to underworld politics, they maintained a perimeter without interfering. The Kong organization had deep connections throughout the city's law enforcement. Dr. Sarah Chun had approached Maya cautiously. "So this is your life," she'd said, looking at the armed men, the violence, the blood. "This is what you've been hiding." "Part of it," Maya had admitted, "but not all of it. I'm still a nurse, Sarah. I still save lives. I'm just also married to someone whose world is darker than mine." "Are you happy?" Sarah had asked. Maya had looked at Kyung-gu, who'd been giving orders to his men while keeping one hand on Maya's back, as if afraid she'd disappear if he stopped touching her. "Yes," she'd said truthfully. "In a complicated, messy, impossible way, yes." 3 months had passed since that night. The incident had forced Maya to live openly as Mrs. Kong, and the transition had been harder than she'd anticipated. Some colleagues had transferred, uncomfortable working with the wife of a crime boss. Others had surprised her with their acceptance. Dr. Sarah Chun had stayed, eventually becoming one of the few people who understood the complexity of Maya's dual existence. Maya still worked her shifts at Seoul Metropolitan Hospital, still saved lives with the same dedication. But now she wore her wedding ring openly, and when gang members came through the ER, they treated her with wary respect. She'd become a bridge between worlds, the healer married to the destroyer, the woman who could stitch wounds while understanding the violence that caused them. Her brother Jamar had finally learned the truth, his initial fury eventually giving way to cautious acceptance when he'd seen how Kyung-gu looked at his sister. "He hurts you, and I don't care how many armed men he has," Jamar had warned. "I'll kill him myself." But Kyung-gu had never hurt her. If anything, the hospital incident had deepened their relationship. He'd stopped trying to keep her separate from his world, finally accepting that Maya was strong enough to navigate both. She'd attended organization meetings, offered strategic insights, and used her medical knowledge to help reduce casualties in the inevitable conflicts that arose. The war with the Choi Syndicate had eventually ended in a tense truce, negotiated partly because neither side could afford the escalation. Lee Hyun-woo had survived, but carried permanent scars, physical and psychological, from his encounter with Maya. He learned what every criminal in Seoul now understood. Mrs. Kong was not to be underestimated. On quiet nights, Maya and Kyung-gu would stand on their penthouse balcony, looking out at the city they both served in different ways. "Do you regret it?" he'd ask sometimes. "Marrying me?" "Never," Maya would reply. "You're the most impossible choice I ever made. And the best one." Their love story was unconventional, born from violence and necessity, built on secrets and survival. But it was theirs, a testament to the human capacity to find connection in the darkest circumstances, to choose hope over despair, to believe that even in a world of moral complexity, love could be simple and true. Maya had learned that strength came in many forms: the physical courage to fight, the moral courage to heal, and the emotional courage to love someone the world called a monster while still maintaining her own integrity. She'd learned that identity wasn't singular but multifaceted, that she could be both a nurse and a mafia wife, both a healer and a fighter. And she'd learned that sometimes the most important promise wasn't the one you made to others, but the one you made to yourself, to stay true to your values even when the world demanded compromise, to choose compassion even when violence seemed easier, to believe in humanity even in the face of its worst impulses. Behind every choice was a lesson: that protection and autonomy weren't opposites but partners, that secrets had costs, but so did truth, that love required not just feeling but action, not just words but sacrifice. Maya and Kyung-gu had built their marriage on these lessons, learning each one through trial and fire, through mistakes and redemptions. Thank you for walking through this journey of darkness and light, of violence and healing, of a nurse who married a mafia boss and discovered that the human heart was far more complex and resilient than she'd ever imagined. In a world that demands we choose between good and evil, Maya and Kyung-gu chose something harder, to acknowledge both within themselves and each other, and to love anyway.